India surging or is India flailing? Or does the truth lie somewhere in the middle? These are the questions posed in a brand new book, Breaking the Mould, by Dr. Raghuram Rajan and Dr. Rohit Lamba. We'll be speaking to the authors in just a moment. The book intriguingly describes India as a country at the crossroads. It asks for India not to follow the China way, but instead develop an India way. What precisely is that India way? The book looks at a host of issues, including how India is performing not just in the regular indices of growth measurement, but also in health, employment, and a host of other issues. And at the end, it very intriguingly poses a set of answers to imagined questions from its readers. Like much else, the book is likely to trigger a big public debate here in India, as the utterances of Dr. Raghuram Rajan often do. So it is my pleasure to introduce on our program today the co-authors of this book. We're joined by Dr. Rohit Lamba. He is one of the co-authors of Breaking the Mold, and also Dr. Raghuram Rajan is with us. And it's good to see you and be back in conversation with you once again. The book is here with me, Breaking the Mold, Reimagining India's Economic Future. So, Dr. Rajan, if I may start with you. The very first sort of opening of the book poses this question. Is the India growth story the sort of surge story that it is made out to be by the believers, or is it the flailing story that it's made out to be by the critics? And your book talks about how a lot that is happening is right, but somewhere in the book you say the critics are largely correct on facts. Some might ask, why do you think that? Why do you think that on a day when the S&P ratings are talking about India becoming the third sort of fastest growing economy in the world, it's already at number 5. Why the pessimism, as one of your imagined readers poses to both of you at the end of your book?
Well, I think if you want to succeed, it's always good to be a little paranoid, right? And figure out what your weaknesses are all the time. And the moment you say we have no weaknesses, we are fantastic, that's when you start failing. And what we're trying to say here is, look, there's a lot to be happy and proud about in India. And there are lots of success stories, many of which we document in the book. At the same time, we have to ask what's not going so well. So take the overall growth issue. I mean, clearly this year we're doing well. It's also true of many other parts of the world. The US had the most spectacular quarter last quarter, 5% growth, when its potential is 2. So it actually exceeded its potential by 3 percentage points. We are doing very well this year. Now, over time, we will grow. And so we will overtake larger nations, which have slowed down in growth, but they're also much less populous. So we will overtake them when we're not particularly rich. The question is, how can we keep growing until we become a rich country? How do we get from here to there? And the answer almost surely is we have to focus on our greatest strength, which is our human capital. There's so many Indians who can, if we can get them good jobs, we will see that growth. The problem is when you asked about the downside are the unemployment numbers. Our unemployment numbers are large. We have enormous numbers of people trying for jobs. You can see huge numbers applying for government jobs, and very few of them get those jobs. So clearly something is also not going well, that there is, in a sense, a bifurcated economy of people who are doing very well, firms that are doing very well, and then teeming millions who simply are not getting jobs. That, to some extent, was a dialogue during the recent state elections. People are looking for work, but not getting it, and instead they're getting freebies.
So I have a lot to ask about freebies, the state elections, as well as jobs. But just to stick to the growth story for a moment, as your own book, both of you opened with acknowledging that India has now overtaken the United Kingdom to become the 5th largest economy in the world. And as I was saying, the S&P numbers suggest that India is well on track to become the 3rd largest economy in the world. Now, Dr. Rajan, I must ask you, you must have followed the fact that supporters of the government pulled out an old interview, a conversation that you had with Rahul Gandhi, where you did not believe that these would be the GDP numbers that you would see, as we've seen in Q2, in quarter two. Do you believe that you were wrong in the projection that you made when you said that, we may not even under 6%?
Yeah, I think the precise statement, which has been replicated ad nauseum by the troll crowd, is that we would be lucky to hit 5% this year. Okay, note those words: lucky to hit 5%. The world economy has been lucky. If you look at projections of US growth at the beginning of the year, it was 1%. As I just said, it hit 5% this quarter, which is 3% above its growth rate. So much of my worry was about the global economy slowing. That hasn't happened. In fact, it's grown even stronger. And that's a common sort of change across the world. It's not something specific to India. There is something specific to India also. The government has gone all out to build infrastructure in the first two quarters, which has helped our growth numbers. That is good, that the government has responded to the slowing by putting out all stops and spending on infrastructure. It's going to become harder as we get into the second half of the year because there's a budget constraint. You can't spend much more than the budget, and we've spent a lot on infrastructure. That said, I welcome any situation where India grows faster than my expectation. I want India to grow. I think it's absolutely
Has India grown faster than your expectations in this past year?
yes, because I said we will be lucky to hit 5, and we are at this point probably going to end the year somewhere in the sixes. That's good. That's absolutely perfect. But the question is, how do we keep at this for the next 20, 25 years, and even expand the pace of growth, because clearly we're not growing fast enough to create the jobs that we need. That is the key question. How do we create those jobs? Because a lot of the growth that we're experiencing even now seems to be relatively jobless.
Let's take that and bring in Dr. Lamba. The growth is relatively jobless, says Dr. Raghuram Rajan. One of the key arguments that I took away from reading the book, and admittedly, I am not a specialist, so I read this as a layperson, is that there is a China way, and it's too late in the day for India to follow the China model, which is an overemphasis on low skill manufacturing. Do you believe that that is the model that has currently been overemphasized by India's economic planners, Dr. Lamba?
Mute.
Just to put things in perspective, right? China's I think it's good to emphasize aggregate numbers, but to keep ourselves in check, given how large we are in terms of our population, whenever we talk about aggregate numbers, we should do a rain check in our heads about what is the per capita GDP. India's per capita GDP is around $2,500 in current prices. China's is 12.5. Korea, just for context, Korea is around in the mid 30s. China reached 12.5 after spectacular growth. Almost 2 to 3 decades of spectacular growth rate. So just to put in perspective, I think short-term celebrations are very important because it keeps the optimism going, both for investor sentiments and to the morale of the country. But just to have, I think what we're trying to argue in the book is beyond these short-term highs and lows. What is the grand vision? What is the economic vision that India has for itself going forward? Because as we emphasize in the book, there are going to be tens of millions of people joining the labor force every year. What are we doing from them? What jobs are we going to be able to give them? And there is a cookie cutter model that has worked well post World War II for most East Asian economies, right? So if you look at the historical growth of the United States and United Kingdom, they grew very slowly over a large period of time, and they also kind of gave freedom to their people in terms of electoral democracy or also democracy in general over time. This is very important. East Asian countries, why it's called the East Asian growth miracle, were able to kind of clock very high growth rates, much higher than how the trajectory of the United States and the United Kingdom in a shorter span of time. And they did that through this structural transformation story of going from surplus in agriculture to low-skill manufacturing, and then eventually going up the value chain. So going from just assembling iPhones to going higher up the value chain, and then eventually they're now slowly moving towards services. India was an anomaly in two very important ways. A, we were a poor democracy, but a poor consistent democracy. right? We were consistently democratic. And second, and these things are related, we try to indicate in the book that we kind of jumped in the largest component of the economy from agriculture to high value services, both low and high value services, but high value services in particular. And what we're trying to argue in the book is that you should not think of this as a bug, but a feature of the India story.
Right.
And our worry is that we are trying to turn the clock in the emphasis. I mean, we're not trying to make a strong case that India should choose necessarily, but in the emphasis, the capital, the intellectual capital of the government, and the resources that the government is putting in, there is a sense in which we are trying to turn the clock back towards low skill manufacturing, and we are trying to propose an alternative in which both the political story of India as being a democratic society and the economic story of being an economy which is driven by services, both direct services and services embedded in manufacturing, which we'll come to later in this interview,
Yeah.
is very important.
Okay, let me ask you, Dr. Rajan. The sort of end of the book is, a description of India as a country at the crossroads. That's what both of you write, and you say that there is an Indian way. Now, if I were to ask you to define what is that Indian way, so I get that it's not the China way. I get that the sometimes messy but consistently democratic subculture is part of the India story, and if it sometimes slows down growth and sometimes enables growth, so be it. But what is this Indian way, Dr. Rajan?
Well, we are poised in the world for a situation where we move towards much more of an emphasis on ideas, much more of an emphasis on intellectual capital, where machines are going to do much more of the grunt work, whether it's robots in manufacturing or it's AI in some kinds of services. So we really have to be, better than those, and that means we have to capture the higher ground if we want to progress. All these S&P numbers, etc., take for granted that the past will continue replicating for the next 10, 15 years. That can't be taken for granted. You have to sort of create the underlying structure. And what that means is rather than focusing on building buildings, we must focus on building minds. That it is brain rather than brawn which we have to focus on.
Is it either or? Is it either or?
No, it's not either or. Where we have a choice, and we can spend, we must spend much more on generating the human capital. So if you think about what might hold us back in that glorious future 20 years from now, think about how many kids are malnutritioned right now, 35% of kids. These are going to be part of the labor force. How can they compete in an advanced world when their brains are stunted, when their health is not adequate? Similarly, when you look at ASR reports, they present a frightening picture of education, right? In fifth grade, 50% of the kids can't do math at the second grade level. Those are the people we are producing. Of course, we're producing geniuses also, but we need to uplift everyone if we are to have a chance at a strong future. And that means investment in our schools, in health, in education. We don't have one university in the top 100 in the world. How are we going to create that intellectual capital, those original drugs? Are we always going to be catch-up, Me Too kinds of drugs? How can we move to a stronger future? A lot of it lies in strengthening our human capital. And we have the potential. What we talk about in the book are lots of positive stories on how this can be done.
I mean, you mentioned Chandrayaan, and I would have given you that example if you didn't mention it. There was a very interesting sort of deep dive into the educational backgrounds of many of the scientists that led the moon mission. And you've seen these numbers that considerably less cost than it took to make Oppenheimer and Barbie, and not all of them went to supposedly some of the sort of top tier universities of the kind that you yourself studied at. So there might be people who say to you, Dr. Rajan, that there is still genius there's still genius in India. It just powered India's moon mission.
No, absolutely. I think ISRO is a great story. It's a great story, as you just said, of engineers from institutions which are high quality, but not necessarily at the very top, because we've lost a lot of our top engineers across the world. They're the Sundar Pichais and the Satya Nadellas who are running firms elsewhere or are populating the universities elsewhere. Think of what we could do if we could harness their energy along with the energy of scientists and engineers here. The wrong message to take away from this is we don't need any more, that we are sufficient. Well, I would ask you then, what big products have we sold the rest of the world? Where is our TikTok? Where is our Boeing airplanes? We don't have those. We need to do those if we're going to become a first world economy, and we have the potential to do that. The question is, how do we build on that for the next 20 years? That, to my mind, is the key question we have to be asking ourselves. And it means that it's not just the guys at the top that we have to worry about. It's not just the students from the IITs or St. Stephens. It has to be people across the board. We have, a survey which says 50% of Indian graduates are unemployable today. And that suggests we have a long way to go to make everyone employable. It's the broad-based thrust that is so key and so important.
Yeah, and and I think the question that Barkha posed, it's this route is important in conceptually and in terms of policy, independent of which path we take. The whether we go down the manufacturing route, whether we go down the services route, having a basically skilled labor force at every level of the pyramid is super important. And this is, and the example, one of the examples we give in the book, for instance, is that India is set to spend about 16,500 crores to set up not even the first generation, but a second generation Micron plant for chips in Gujarat. Great, it's good, but just to put it in context, right? The entire higher education budget of India last year was 44,000 crores. So just put these two numbers in your head. All the IITs, IISCs, TIFR, central universities, the budget allocated to them was 44,000 crores. We are putting more than one third of that, 16,500 crores, into a plant which may generate 5,000 jobs. So priorities are important.
Right. And let me jump in on a slightly related question. What is the best way for the state, irrespective of who's in government, to enable this, right? And the sort of debate, the present debate, is around freebies, subsidies, welfareism. We've just had elections that have concluded. And one of the reasons, for example, Dr. Rajan, for the win for the BJP, one of the reasons, not the only reason, in a state like Madhya Pradesh, where the chief minister has been now incumbent for almost 20 years, is seen to be a welfare scheme targeted at girls and women. Which actually gives 1,000 rupees straight into the bank account of women, called the Ladli Yojana. Now, you have not been a fan of subsidies, but you have been, you do admire the efficacy of DBTs, direct benefit transfers. How do you see this debate? Because today every party is competing at election time to offer what have come to be known. The Prime Minister calls them reveries, somebody else calls them freebies. How do we understand the subsidies versus freebies versus direct cash benefit schemes?
Yeah, I think it's very simple. My benefit is a benefit, your benefit is a freebie or a reverie. So, that's how political parties see each other. Let's get away from this particular issue beyond recognizing that, yes, direct transfers to relatively poor people, if appropriately targeted, can be a huge benefit, because it can give them the means by which they can make their lives a little better and invest in their own future, invest in girls going to school, but even boys going to school, better nutrition, which will help reduce the problems of malnutrition that we talked about. So we are not against. In fact, we have a whole chapter in the book on how we reduce inequality, how targeted transfers can help by empowering the poor. That said, that can't be your only focus. You have to think about, many parents over the pandemic took their children back into government schools, which they had left because the government schools were not providing enough quality for their children. And so now that they're poorer, they've gone back to the government schools, but you can't essentially condemn them to a second-class existence by not improving the quality of government schools. And they differ widely between government schools, say in Delhi, and government schools in Jharkhand. There is a huge difference in quality, which means a huge difference in life chances between those two sets of kids who go to one to this place and one to that place. We have, excuse me, we have an ability to remedy these differences. And that was what government should focus on. Clearly, education is a state subject, but the center can aid a helping hand. And now, with the help of technology, we have so many ways we can do better than what we are doing in improving the quality of education. For example, one of the biggest problems in schools is some kids fall behind. When they fall behind, the teacher has too many kids on their hands to look after these children who are falling behind. Teachers teach to the average, not the lowest or the highest. And so they lose the kids who are falling behind. With technology, we can actually identify those kids faster, and we can try and bring them up to speed if we have the right incentives in place within the schools, but also we have the right technology. In fact, going forward, if all goes well, we'll have AI tutors for the kids falling behind. But this is not just techno babble. There are places like Pratham which have used technology to bring kids up to speed in a much better way. And we have to learn and we have to recognize this is priority one. Because if our kids aren't capable of getting jobs down the line, it doesn't matter what we do on the growth front, they still will not get those jobs.
So I want to ask what some might say is counterintuitive. In your book, both of you, let me take this to you, Dr. Lamba. You paint a picture of, in a way, the troubles that lie beneath, as it were, the GDP data, the fifth largest economy story, the S&P ratings, and you talk about jobs, jobs, jobs. We've just had the BJP romp home in 3 state elections, right? And if there was this kind of distress, some might ask, how then, why then has the BJP won again? How then do we explain the fact that the Congress has not been able to win a second term for any state government since 2014? And I'm not trying to draw both of you into a sort of taking political sides. I'm just trying to understand the concept. And Dr. Rajan, correct me if I'm wrong. Did I read this in your book or somewhere else where you quoted TN Nayanan, I think, and you did, right? You quoted Nayanan, and Nayanan wrote this column about how even if people don't see a clear economic future, they still identify the government with the future. So they don't necessarily link their idea of India or their idea of their own lives to their immediate economic reality. So I'm just trying to understand that. Dr. Lamba, if you want to take that.
Yeah, Barkha, I think this is something we delve or we try to delve deeply in the third part of the book, and I think it's an interesting both an academic and a lived debate, right? Like, so I think you travel for your stories extensively across the country, and I think we'll be amiss if, and both in doing our job honestly, if we said there is not a genuine and deep jobs crisis in India. It's for everyone to see. I think
no, I agree, but it doesn't seem to necessarily result in collective political rage. That's the only point I was trying to make. Yeah.
Let me give the viewers like a 2 or 3 kind of frameworks to think about this. Okay, one is think of the term prisoners of our own instruments, and think of the term demand diffusion and demand deflection. Okay, so what do I mean by this? There is a demand, right? You saw the protests with Agniveer. You saw the protests with when there was a scam in the railway recruitment. Even the farmers' protests to some extent, were a reflection of what we call in the book the tunnel effect, right? One lane in a tunnel is moving very quickly, the other lane is static, and then the frustration grows. Now the question is, what forms does the frustration manifest in, right? So there is a demand. It's very diffused. Okay, you need some kind of collective action to make that demand visible. Now, how are we prisoners of our instruments? We are used to certain instruments as people to premise our demand on. So what are these instruments? The instruments are broadly now limited to reservations in government jobs. And now the new thing in the last 10 years is welfarism. So we organize around these instruments, right? This is what we know as people. I want to ask my government something, I will organize my demand around instruments that I'm familiar with. The third is demand deflection. So as a government, I understand that doing the hard things is very hard, like, fixing education, fixing health. It's not like that the government is not trying, or any government for that matter, they try. But to claim, it's much easier to claim credit around instruments that I'm comfortable with. So I also, as a government, go back to jobs and welfareism. And this is not about just the BJP or the Congress. It's just generally a political economy story of India. And I think this is a problem, and this is where we try to come in, both as as intellectuals and civil society, to move the needle on what are the instruments around which people can demand things. And I think, to say so, since most people agree that there is a jobs crisis, I think what we're trying to argue in the book is that India needs to have a vision about its own self as to how it's going to generate these jobs. And it's very important to understand, when you look at the data, right? Like, just when people look at the data and when you report the data, especially on jobs, it's very important to understand that only aggregate numbers are not the right prism, because India also has a very high amount of disguised unemployment. So what does that mean? That means that if one person or two people are sufficient to till a field, there are six people on that field working, and they're all counted as employment. Even the services sector, suppose you go to get your coffee at a Starbucks in Delhi or Bombay, there are seven people behind the counter. This is disguised unemployment, because the productivity of the individual is much lower than what it should be in driving the aggregate productivity of the country. So yes, there is a jobs crisis. Yes,
Right.
you're right that it is not being manifested in a political voice, but I think that is a failure of us, both as an intellectual class, or maybe to some extent even the media, to provide avenues so that the instruments can change, and the demand is no longer diffuse but concrete. I hope that makes sense.
Well,
Yes.
Rohit,
Dr.
uh,
Rajan, go ahead. You want to add to that? Yeah.
the demand is concrete, but as Rohit says, it's channeled. The
Yeah.
demand is for more reservations. I mean, think about what is happening in Manipur and the fight between the Kukis and the Metis. Some of it is about reservation. And similarly, I mean, you hear this again and again when we're talking things like caste census and so on. It's all about reservations. And the second aspect is government jobs. So it's either it's can I get more access to government jobs, and can you create more government jobs? But really, the answer has to be
Mhm.
that the private sector has to expand. There is no way for the government to create the kinds of jobs that we need to deal with the deficit that we already have, but also for the teeming millions who will come in. The numbers are just hard to appreciate, that we're talking about, tens of millions every year for the next 30 years. Those are the kinds of jobs we have to create when the overall job creation is so much lower. So, bottom line is we need to think about how we enable that. And part of our answer is you need to create the material that can take the jobs that in business people want to look for that because they see that this is well developed human capital that I can use. And that's why the answer has to start with, let's start with education and healthcare. And yeah, you will say this is going to take time. Obviously, it will take time, but very soon you will see the results paying off in small ways if we upgrade the quality of our human capital. On the other hand, if we do nothing, we will end up 15, 20 years from now with having 35% of the workforce which simply cannot do any work because they were malnutritioned early on in life.
And just to come on
Yeah.
that, just
Yeah.
in relation to the GDP question you'd asked and what Raghu said, I
Yes.
think, just sort of to differentiate between short-term kind of data that is coming in and the long-term path that we are on, it is whenever we see GDP data in the next 5 years, we should ask ourselves, how is private consumption doing, and where is private investment? Both of them continue to be very, very low. So as Raghu was saying, that a lot of it is driven by government push, which is very good. But to be on some sort of sustainable growth path, we need private investment to pick up, which has been low for almost a decade, and we need consumption to pick up.
I
So
mean, last point, Barkha, just to emphasize this. Why aren't foreign investors, I'm talking about FDI, beating its way into India? If you look at the last couple of years, it's fallen off. India is the China plus one of those countries which could be an offset to China. India, of course, is growing fast. All this would mean that foreign capital should be, jumping in. But it's not. We're trying to attract it through, industrial freebies. And that suggests there's something which is not right, which we need to remedy, even as we are growing fast.
In the last few minutes of this conversation, I want to turn towards the end of your book, which has a very interesting sort of narrative device where you anticipate some of the questions that people like myself, but also the general reader, would put to both of you. And you take on the question of the place of religion in our democracy. And you talk about Hinduism, and you talk about how the very sort of essence of Hinduism is to be, I think the phrase you use is open and diffused, and you give it an economic nomenclature. You take a word from economics. I'm going to let you tell the audience what that is and then explain it. So, Dr. Rajan, when you had to grapple with that question, why was that question important in a book on reimagining India's economic future? How is it linked? And B, how do you see this debate around, are we a Hindu nation? What is the place of Hinduism? 80% of India is Hindu. You've anticipated these questions from your readers, so go ahead.
So, look, I think we were born as a democracy which wasn't identified with a religion. Yes, we are 80% Hindu. Both Rohit and I are Hindus. But that doesn't, in a sense, as a country, we are a secular democracy. And I think that means we treat all religions equally. You are free to practice your religion. Pakistan chose a different route. It became a Muslim country. And we deliberately didn't do that because of the wisdom of our founding fathers. We keep saying in the book that this kind of stance is really important going forward because we want to be an attractive country. We want to do business with the rest of the world. We want them to see us as a hospitable, welcoming country. That is important. But even within our country, if we want to make the best use of our human resources, the way to do that is to treat everyone equally. No appeasement, but no discrimination either. Equal treatment is what we want. And what we see again and again in the book is how do we create that equal treatment? It means focusing on making government work for everyone. And what that requires, very importantly, is a strong democracy, a place where even the poorest person can stand up and say, I need my government service. Why is it not being provided? Without a fear of being put in jail for violating some act or the other. We also need, in many ways, government to learn. We need data to be collected. Here is where you did wrong. Here is where things are going off track. Here's what you need to fix again. And so that requires, again, because we're talking about a new path for government, it requires course correction repeatedly, which is why you have to know where you're going wrong. And where you're going to go, knowing that means you should be open to criticism. You cannot shut down critics and say, I don't want that fellow appearing on TV because he's always protesting about this or that. That's the kind of country we need. We have the possibilities.
If I could just get Rohit to come in on that also, you do tackle this very politically loaded phrase, appeasement. And I think the way you address it is by saying that, yes, political parties have been guilty sometimes of backing radical politics, but there is no policy, there is no government policy that has led to Muslims being economically better off than the others. So if you just want to weigh in on that. Right.
See, Barkha, when I was growing up, my nana used to use this term, which has always stuck with me, called santulan. And I think this is super important in terms of the discourse on the political economy and how politics interacts with economics. And we really try to, carefully try to build this argument in the third part of the book, as you're pointing out. And I think we're very straightforward. We're very open, at least, in our opinion, about saying, yes, there was a left-wing tinge to how history was written in India. Arguably there has been some kind of appeasement with radicals across religions in India. And this is a problem. It's independent of political parties. It's independent of, we as a society and as a civil society and as citizens must acknowledge this. Having said that, how do we look at ourselves going ahead in the future? And we say that for the economic model that we have in mind, creativity and ability to criticize and build arguments is very important. And we cannot, this cannot be emphasized enough. There's plenty of historical evidence to suggest that, societies which are tolerant, which allow dissent, are the ones that end up being most creative. And we want India to be a creative economy. In terms of, the narrative around appeasement, we should, as Raghu was saying, we should always try to go back to the data and try to critically evaluate ourselves. Has there been appeasement in some way? Who's benefiting from which policies? And I think, we should try to critically analyze, what kind of good, so the example we give is about, the policemen in Uttar Pradesh, and a very small fraction of them are Muslims. So in comparison to the fraction of the population in the state. So we must critically evaluate all these things through data and inform the public about where policy is going right and where policy is going wrong.
And there's some very interesting data in the book. I'll leave it for readers to read it on polygamy. You pick up one of the most politicized conversations, and I urge people to read the book and read for yourself. Very interesting aggregation of data there. Dr. Rajan, I'll give you the last word. One of the big ongoing debates in the country, it's election season, is around electoral bonds. The book does deal with that question. You're not a fan. Arun Jaitley, whom you once worked closely with, argued passionately that of all bad options of how to fund politics, this was the least bad one. The issue is now before the Supreme Court. Just a final word on why that's so important, why you felt it important enough to put it in your book, and where you stand on that. We now know from other accounts that Urjit Patel, who was RBI governor before you, was vociferously opposed to bonds. We have some of that now in the public domain. This issue of electoral bonds, I'll give you the last word on that, Dr. Rajan.
Well, I think it creates an unlevel playing field because it gives a legitimate route for those who have access to business funds. And most of what is going into electoral bonds is business funds. So governments in power get that access very easily. It is not clear whether the opposition has as equal access. But what is most worrying about these electoral bonds is we have no idea what promises were made. So do the businesses that are putting in the money expect to get a quid pro quo? In a democracy, we should know who's giving money to which party, and then we can monitor the party's policies to see whether it's favoring the people who put the money in. So now we have not only an unequal playing field, we have a non-transparent playing field. The last problem, which I think is very pernicious, is if one party, the incumbent party, has access to legitimate funds, while the others don't, then it's also very easy to use the instruments of government to attack those who don't. And when they're using black money, et cetera, to hang them out to dry, saying, "Oh, you are corrupt, you're this, that." But you've essentially narrowed their ability to fight elections by ensuring all the legitimate money goes to incumbents. So this is essentially creating a very unequal political system. We've written about it in great detail in the book. It's important that we look at it because we already have enormous powers for incumbents in this country. To add to that with an electoral bond system, which typically goes to incumbent governments rather than the opposition, I think is to entrench in incumbency. That's the last thing you want in a democracy.
And again, Barkha, this is independent of who is in power, right? Just as a system, like whoever is in power will have a natural advantage if it's not transparent, if the list is not is public.
Yes, I mean, parties who are receiving money via electoral bonds across political affiliations and across the spectrum right now. The Supreme Court will have the last word on that. I do have to close now. There's so much more to talk about. This could go on endlessly, but I know we're all on limited time, especially both of you. So thank you, Dr. Rajan and Dr. Lamba. Breaking the Mould, Reimagining India's Economic Future is a very interesting read, even if you're not an economist, and especially if you're not an economist, but you care about India, as all of us do please read the book. It was a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you and take care.
Thank you so much, Barkha.
Thank you. Mojo Story has always made a commitment to its viewers to go to where the story is. And as you can see here, we are at the epicenter of the Israel war on Gaza. We are right at the front line, about 1 mile from the Gaza Strip, as the Israeli military gets ready with its tanks and its gunners to begin its final frontal assault that will take troops into Gaza. As we said, we are not like other organizations. We believe in giving you all sides of a story objectively and as much as possible from the ground. And that's exactly what we're doing here, covering the biggest global story today from the epicenter of the war zone. So please, we need your support. Support us, become a Mojo member, subscribe to us, spread the word, and thank you for your support.